Oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin. You've heard that these brain chemicals control your sex life, but most of what you've been told is wrong. I'm Dr. Rena Malik, urologist and pelvic surgeon, and welcome back to the Rena Malik MD podcast, your source for evidence-based information about your sexual health and more. On today's episode, I'm sharing what neuroscience really tells us about sexual pleasure. We'll explore why dopamine decreases and not increases during orgasm, why cuddling after sex affects your relationships, and how pornography affects your brain according to science. Your most powerful sexual organ is not, in fact, between your legs. It's between your ears. It's your brain. It essentially orchestrates everything from how you're attracted to someone to how your body responds during sex and even the bond you form with your partners. And unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation about how things like pornography and masturbation impact your brain that I'm also going to be talking about. So in this episode, I'm going to review some key takeaways from our two prior podcast guests who have dedicated their careers to understanding the brain-sex connection. First is a recent guest from our podcast, Dr. Jim Pfaus, a world-renowned neuroscientist and professor at Charles University in Prague. His research specifically has helped us better understand pleasure pathways in the brain and how they influence sexual behavior and bonding. Second is Dr. Nicole Prause, a neuroscientist who studies physiological and neurological responses during sexual arousal, and she's been instrumental in debunking myths about sexual addiction and pornography use. Her work has really challenged a lot of the misconceptions about pornography and sexual behavior. And unfortunately, she's been put on the receiving end of some threats from groups that really oppose her research findings. Whether you're in a long-term relationship, navigating the dating world, or just curious about your own sexuality, there's going to be something here for everyone in this episode. Let's start at the beginning. How does your brain actually learn what it finds sexually appealing? One of the most interesting things that I found about sexual neuroscience is that our early experiences with pleasure really create some powerful imprints that affect what we look for in pleasure. And Dr. Pfaus explained this, that basically our first sexual experiences tend to shape our preferences through a process similar to imprinting, as he puts it.
So your first experiences with pleasure are the things that are really important. If female rats, for example, have their first experiences in a chamber that doesn't give them pleasure, that doesn't allow them to, say, control the initiation and the rate of copulation with a male, which they really like to do. When they can do it, they really like it. Well, then they don't like it, right? And if you give them enough experience that way, you could even put them into a chamber that allows them to do that, but then they show a lot of fighting. They show a lot of rejection responses. Like, it's like, oh God, this again, I'm not into it. Whereas if their first experiences are quite pleasurable, then they are into it. And in fact, you can put them in a less opportune chamber, for example, that doesn't let them do that, but they still like sex. It's almost like having good sex makes bad sex not less bad, but it really allows you to differentiate. Whereas if you've only had bad sex, you make an interpretation that good sex is probably still going to be bad.
This is really interesting. So our brain is essentially creating a template or a love map based on these sort of early pleasurable experiences. And these tend to engage our dopamine system, which combines both motivation to do something and action. And so when you receive pleasure from an orgasm, it essentially reinforces that system, but it also sensitizes our oxytocin systems. And oxytocin is a chemical in our brain that is used to help sort of stimulate bonding with another person. And those together create a template of what we find attractive. Knowing this can help explain why, for example, we might become really obsessed or intensely focused on our new partner. You can't think about anything else. You're always missing them. You're always thinking about them. It exactly goes back to sort of these brain systems.
The pleasure, which is produced by opioids and serotonin, which are emitted at orgasm, for example, they come back to reinforce not only and sensitize not only your dopamine system, but they also sensitize your oxytocin systems so that now you personify that reward in this template of what you find attractive.
The good news is these patterns aren't permanent, and so your brain is adaptable throughout your lives. You can still find other things pleasurable or enjoyable. Dr. Pfaus explains it here.
Once you've had that really good experience, your brain tags it and says, oh, that's what this is about. Aha. Okay. So now you're going to go after that and you're going to, build the habits and everything that allows you now to have pleasure.
So, again, our brains are remarkably adaptable. And when you have new positive experiences, that can actually reshape your expectations and responses. So, you're not stuck finding that only one thing in particular is arousing or exciting. Now, once you found someone attractive, your brain sends signals to you to try and get that type of person if they're available to you.
So, it's attractive to me. I'm going to go pursue. Now, how am I going to pursue? I'm going to do whatever I can do to move closer. And that engages what's called your dopamine system. And it engages it in such a way that it's kind of combining your motivation and your action together, right? Because that's really what dopamine controls. It's not reward or pleasure per se, but it's really kind of the motivation to go towards something that's pleasurable or to move away from something that's not pleasurable, right? That's actually going to be, destructive to you, right? So you engage the system, and that system is connected not only to your emotional brain, but it's also connected to your frontal lobe.
The question then arises, how does having pleasure by yourself or masturbating affect your brain? Dr. Pfaus's research has shown that different types of sexual stimuli affect the brain differently. When you view pornography, it does obviously activate your brain regions, but masturbation and sex with a partner always produce a much higher intensity of activation. She notes,
I wish people could sit in the lab with me sometimes and just watch someone watching pornography and where all the physiology is going, like their brain responses. And then the second they put their hand on their genitals, like just everything increases 10x.
Bottom line, human touch is far more powerful than anything you can see on a screen. Next up, let's talk about what's happening chemically in our brain during sexual experiences, because there's a lot of misconceptions about brain chemicals like dopamine and oxytocin, especially in discussions about sex and relationships. First off, let me just explain what happens to the brain during sex. First, you have sexual desire, and that occurs when certain brain areas are activated, and those control things like motivation, decision-making, reward-seeking, and anticipation. And so a lot of these processes happen below our conscious awareness, meaning you might smell perfume, you might see someone that has physical characteristics that are similar to someone you've liked, and feel desire without even really consciously thinking about it. Desire is influenced by hormones, particularly testosterone, but it's not as simple as low testosterone, desire low, or high testosterone, desire high. The brain has sort of an on-off system, both excitatory systems and inhibitory systems that are sort of on at the same time. Like you have a hot water and a cold water faucet, and when the hot is more than the cold, you're going upwards, and when the cold is more than the hot, you're going downwards. There's also this common belief that orgasm creates a massive dopamine flood in the brain, but Dr. Pfaus's research actually shows that this is a major misconception. She emphasizes,
one big dopamine myth I hear all the time is, when I climax, I get an explosion of dopamine. Dopamine goes down at climax. Please stop this. Like, it does not explode with climax. During arousal, it does go up. Mm-hmm. The activity absolutely increases. There are different types of dopamine. It's most common in D2, D3 receptor types. So very well replicated. That absolutely happens. You can view pornography and it will go up. The second you put your hand on your genitals,
it explodes.
10x. I'm overestimating here. Please don't hold me to that number. But it's many-fold in terms of the dopamine that's experienced. When we have people into the lab, we use electroencephalography. So that is not dopamine sensitive, just to be clear, but another measure of like excitation. Absolutely same thing. Like the second the hand goes on the genitals from a partner, the response is much, much higher than when we just showed them images of pornography. So just know, does dopamine go up when you view porn? Probably. There's every reason to think so, pretty well replicated, but it does not explode with climax. It's much higher when you touch yourself. It's even higher when a partner touches you.
Now, what about arousal and orgasm? This is where we see some of the most dramatic changes in brain activity, and they're so fascinating. So when you become aroused, multiple brain regions are activating simultaneously, right? You're seeing things, so your visual processing centers activate, and they help you appreciate what you're seeing. And then if you're in the right place and right time, meaning it's okay to have sex, your brain activates your parietal and prefrontal cortices that then look at attention and higher thinking. This this then basically makes you zone in or focus on the goal of having sex. There's also emotional processing centers like the amygdala that get activated and reward processing areas that help you realize that when you pursue this arousal, you're going to get pleasure. Now, it's actually very complicated, and your brain, as I mentioned, needs to be in the right state of mind to get aroused. For example,
there are studies where they've put vibrators on a penis, and if you just turn the vibrator on, usually they won't get much of an erection or any erection. But if you provide a stimulus, so put pornography in front of them, then they start to get an erection. So it's not just the stimulus, but the interpretation that's really important for processing something as being sexual.
In early arousal, Dr. Pfaus describes,
so the early phase is really marked by increased excitation. So when we have increased blood pressure, increased heart rate, breathing rate, all of those things being controlled in the autonomic nervous systems.
So Dr. Pfaus's research has also identified an interesting phase that occurs right before orgasm. And this might explain why edging can be so pleasurable. And edging is essentially getting towards climax, but then holding off and trying to stay in that place for a long period of time. So essentially what she describes is there's a time right before orgasm where your brain enters this sort of very unique state of reduced cognitive control and heightened sensory focus, almost like meditation. And so your brain sort of gets into this sort of euphoric flow state. She describes it as,
my collaborator, Greg Siegel, and I at Pittsburgh were watching all these brains and the sympathetic nervous system measure while this small group of men and women were going through climax in our lab. And we saw exactly what we'd expected. It goes up, 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 up. And at some point, it like turns and goes down. We're like, oh no, it fell off. So we see alpha waves in the brain spike. So these are waves between 8 and 12 hertz or cycles per second in the brain start to increase a lot. Sympathetic nervous system goes down. And we assume something's wrong with the equipment. And we see it in another woman and another woman. And we're like, what the hell is this? And we think that now it's not published, so that's why I said my wild theory. We think this is a real effect. We think it's an undocumented phase of the sexual response cycle. So I think what's occurring, and it could be what they used to call plateau phase. Mm-hmm. So we'd say like, oh, we get so aroused and then we hang out there until climax happens. So it seems to be really tied to this time when you try and get to that point, and we're guessing that it has to do with cognitive control. So it's like if you get a certain amount of arousal, at some point, you don't want your brain just orgasming all the time. That's not safe. That's not effective. There's lots of reasons not to have that too easy. So if it's safe in your environment to have a climax, how would you know? How would you want to allow that to happen? It's also gross synchronous firing across the brain, which is frighteningly close to a seizure. You don't have motor control during this period. So we're saying like it kind of makes sense. You may have to reduce the control of your brain that allows it to go into a synchronous firing state.
I found that fascinating. Now let's sort of turn towards what happens during climax. So during orgasm, the hypothalamus, which is essentially like your brain's hormone command center, it's activated and it releases oxytocin, which helps you bond with your sexual partner and amplifies those feelings of pleasure and connection. The brain's reward system also processes the flood of sensations, which triggers dopamine release that creates intense pleasure. Now remember, this goes down after orgasm. Your brain also tags the experience with emotional significance, essentially saying, hey, don't forget this and do it again. Meanwhile, your prefrontal cortex, which is like the responsible adult in your brain that tells you what's a good idea or what's not, temporarily goes offline. This is why if someone asks you to do something in the middle of sex, it's not the right time to make that decision. Now, there's also physical things that are going on during orgasm, and those are coordinated by the brain's motor coordination center, or the cerebellum. And it sends signals to your pelvic floor muscles, creating that pulsating feeling during orgasm. And actually, your pelvic floor contracts at a very specific rate involuntarily. It's a rate of every 0.8 seconds. Did you know that orgasm is actually a learned experience?
So people who, for example, have never had an orgasm, you can't hypnotize them to have an orgasm. An orgasm is a state that your brain learns when you have the first few of them. But it's nothing that's kind of in there pre-programmed.
Now, I know everyone is curious about multiple orgasms and why women have multiple orgasms so easily. Dr. Pfaus had a really interesting finding in her lab where women were reporting multiple orgasms. However, based on the analysis they were doing, they were not actually seeing the characteristic findings of multiple orgasms. So it might be that they're getting close to orgasm multiple times, but they really have only one orgasm.
We allowed in our study for women who felt like they might or could have multiples in the lab to go for it. So we said
that same study of 24 women.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So we said, if you feel like you're going to have another one, go ahead, knock yourself out. And this is how they let us know, so we don't like knock on the door too soon, or anything. Yeah. And we had a handful of women who reported that they did. And in each of those cases, they did not have the stereotypical contractions that occur in the pelvic floor during climax.
Interesting.
Right. So from a physical perspective, when we're studying it, we usually define climax as 8 to 12 contractions that occur starting 0.8 seconds apart and increase in latency to their termination. Like, it has this very specific, highly stereotyped definition.
Right.
We always see it in men. And so we're saying, like, what happened? Like, are they, again, we have to think, are they able to report? Are they willing to report? We have to go through all those things. I don't think they're lying, right? There was really no reason in that setting. So assuming they really thought they were, it raises the question, are people who think they're having multiples actually just having a completely different experience that's not physiological climax?
Now, what happens after sex? This is also important for how well you bond with your partner. Dr. Pfaus's research suggests that cuddling after sex isn't just nice. It's actually a crucial part of bonding with your partner. He notes,
if the couple remains in this closeness, usually facial closeness, that they'll begin to get a sense of the other individual as their loved object, and that they would want to be with that loved object. And this is, of course, after the generative act. So this was cuddling after sex. So what happens when people don't cuddle after sex? Do they turn that system off? Or do they, fall in love with the interior of the Uber that they're riding home in because they've just had they've just swiped, left, and they've had a little encounter, and now they're going home when all of this beautiful neurochemical soup in their brain is trying to get them to cuddle, right? Or, and this is an interesting point, especially for people that have casual, on Tinder or Grindr, who have casual sex, you find that that when they defy the laws of casuality, right, and they actually do cuddle, and they can't move, and they're both lying there together to the point they fall asleep and they wake up the next morning. Well, now they have this awkward situation in which they're sharing breakfast, and they seem to move over the hump because now they want to be with each other again. And more likely than not, that incident evolves them into a relationship. So it's like, okay, so now you're experiencing it together as opposed to apart.
Right.
So interestingly, when we did our first experiments with male rats with the conditioned sexual behaviors that they show where they had a female partner that was scented, if we pulled the female out right after ejaculation, they didn't form the partner preference. But if we let them stay with the female during his post-ejaculatory refractory period, which was like 5 minutes for a rat, right? Well, now even having one post-ejaculatory refractory period with the female there, he showed the partner preference. So there is something to what, for lack of a better term, I call it just post-orgasmic learning, that if you're in with the partner, you are learning about your partner. You're beginning to find your partner really attractive, and you're seeing things, and this is what Stendhal said, you're seeing things in the partner, what he called them new perfections. You're seeing new perfections in the partner. And what you're seeing are facial features, body, skin type, the feel of the skin, the feel of the face, the feel of the lips, all these things. And your brain puts it together as, that's my partner. Yeah, this is my partner now. That's my girlfriend. That's my boyfriend. That's my partner. That's mine. Mine. And, this is also something that oxytocin plays a role in, which is jealousy. And so if your partner goes away, that oxytocin dopamine interplay is now disrupted horribly, right? And you feel you can't just say, oh, okay, see ya. Like the Seinfeld episode where she wants to break up and he's like, oh, okay, no problem. Well, yeah, Jerry wasn't bonded, okay? She might have been, but he wasn't at all, right? So he could just say goodbye. So if that system isn't turned on and cuddling makes that happen, right, especially after the generative act, as Stendhal said, then it goes. It's just not there.
Now, I want to address some common concerns and misconceptions about pornography and masturbation. There's a lot of anxiety about whether these activities are going to rewire the brain or interfere with real-life relationships. Now, Dr. Prause's research has specifically looked at the effects of pornography on the brain and the sexual response. And contrary to what a lot of people think, her evidence shows something quite different.
The big fear I think that most people have is like, well, if you view a lot of pornography, that dampens your response. So we also said, well, how much do you watch of this stuff normally? And it turns out the more they watch normally, the more arousal they reported to the partner in the lab. We're like, okay, this is the opposite of what everyone's saying.
Yeah. So there's really no strong evidence that pornography erodes the ability to pair bond or enjoy partnered sex. In fact, people who watch more pornography are thought to maybe just have a higher sex drive and tend to be more likely to experiment or try new things. The concern that pornography acts like a super stimulus and overwhelms the brain's normal response system, well, Dr. Prause's research debunks that myth as well. As she explains, direct sexual contact, meaning touching your actual genitals, tends to produce a lot more physiologic activation than actually viewing porn alone. And the differences aren't even close. Touch is significantly more powerful than anything you can get from just watching something. Now, the interesting thing here is there's something very specific about human touch from another person. It's because it activates certain fibers in our skin that our brain perceives as pleasurable. And you can't get that from a device or even yourself.
So I say when there are people interacting with one another, the only time you get a stimulus of what we call the C afferent fibers that are in the skin. So anywhere you have glabrous skin, when they're being touched, these C afferent fibers become active only when being touched by another person without a glove on their hand at a moderate frequency stroking speed. Highly selective. You cannot do it to yourself.
Now, Dr. Pfaus noted that we tend to get stuck in habits with sexual behavior just like we do in other areas of life. As humans, we tend to like things to be predictable, but that tends us to be more likely to get bored. And this applies to sex also. So pornography tends to provide this venue for arousal and fantasy that can introduce novelty. While I'm not going to paint a perfectly rosy picture, sometimes when you have imagery that you're watching that's so intense, it can make real life sex a little less exciting or even boring because it can't compare to what you're seeing on the screen. This is when you have to say, hey, this is probably not the best thing that I'm doing right now and I need to ask for help. And there's so many people you can ask. You can see a urologist, a sex therapist, and sort of work through those issues. And I see a lot of patients who do feel shame or distress about using pornography or even their sexual fantasies. They worry that this is causing issues with sexual function or erectile dysfunction, but oftentimes it's because of the guilt or what we call moral incongruence related to how they view their essentially pornography viewing or masturbation. Now, you may think that just stopping masturbating or pornography works the best, but Dr. Prause's research found that these abstinence-only approaches can actually increase shame and lead to negative mental health outcomes.
The abstinence approaches seem to be harmful. So we have a few studies now showing that people that say, I got to stop entirely, it has to be cold turkey. Usually it's in an addiction framework. So they say, zero use is the only acceptable use. Those folks have reported having some suicidal ideation in response to what they call a relapse, which sometimes even includes masturbation. We've even seen folks say, they have a nocturnal emission, so they ejaculate during the evening and say, I've relapsed. That's it. I'm never going to recover from this. I can't do anything about it. I was asleep. What am I supposed to do? And we're like, right, you're asleep, normal, it's fine. But when people have an abstinence goal, it can be very distressing to them. Surprisingly. So, in our sample, we're like, What? Like we kind of asked thinking most people would endorse this, and now I'm so glad we did. A lot of people report the primary emotional experience they have in response to what they feel is a relapse is shame. So an abstinence intervention, I'd say, is a shame-based intervention. That is, you're using shame to try and change behavior, which almost never works. So I think if you try an abstinence goal, you're very likely to fail. You're very likely to have harm from it.
Now, a more effective approach is acceptance and commitment therapy, which helps people sort of match their behaviors with their personal values. And this works because a lot of people who feel sort of stressed about pornography use tend to come from backgrounds where they have really strong moral or religious criticisms of sex outside of marriage or masturbation. And essentially addressing that underlying shame is often more important than focusing on the behavior itself. And this is important because what happens is sometimes you're using the pornography or the masturbation as a way to deal with the negative feelings you're getting from the shame or the guilt. And so once you've dealt with that, you no longer feel the compulsion to use more pornography or masturbate, and it takes care of itself. Now, I think the important thing to take home is that having curiosity about new things, variety in your sex life are normal. And as long as you're doing things that are pleasurable, consensual, and safe, and they're not distracting you from being a productive member of society and creating and maintaining great relationships, it's nothing to be ashamed about. I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode on the most powerful organ you have for sex, your brain. If you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe to the podcast. Only about 20% of you listening are actually subscribed. So make sure to do that. It's a zero-cost way to support, and share it with friends who might actually benefit from this information. And as always, remember to take care of yourself because you're worth it.